Keeping the pyramid model in mind, let's take a look at some of the major differences that do exist between perceivers and judgers. Obviously, I say major differences. There's a lot of more subtle things, and if you're interested, again, I will send you a reading list, but here are some of the big ones that I can probably think of. And keep in mind that all these differences exist as a result of the pyramid model. So some of the major differences. The first major difference, of course, is what I call a decision timeline. So what this means is that how long does it take you to come to a decision? Say at some arbitrary time equals 0. How long would it take you to come to a final decision and to take action on that decision, right? The major difference in terms of perceivers and judgers in this case is that perceivers tend to take a lot longer than judgers to come to a decision. In many instances, and these are the more of the extreme cases, judgers may come to a decision prematurely and end up not, their solution may not be optimal and may not be comprehensive. On the other hand, perceivers, very often is the case, they may never come to a decision at all because they are so hesitant to really, they never think that they've gathered enough data. This is sort of the core mindset of a perceiver, is that they have a tendency to think that you can never know enough, therefore we have to delay final judgment or our final hypothesis as push it as far back as possible. This is a very holistic approach, more suitable, of course, to exploratory analysis. Now, this difference in timeline lends itself to perceivers and judgers being seen in very different ways. Judgers are generally seen to be more organized with a greater adherence and respect for deadlines, whereas perceivers tend to be seen as these sort of chronic procrastinators. And this is sort of true, but it's important to see why it's true in relation to what we've learned so far. Now, a judger, let's say that you're a student and you've been assigned a research paper. The judger will probably, spend maybe a few days researching the topic, but then he will step back and say, I think I have enough data to write this paper well, and then he will write it and then naturally hand it in. On the other hand, perceivers, taking that inductive approach, will probably spend a disproportionately large amount of time just doing the research itself, because he believes that no matter how much research I conduct, I still don't think I know enough to write in a comprehensive manner on this topic. However, reality eventually catches up to him, and he realizes that, oh, shit, this paper is due tomorrow, I better write something. And this is a very nice example illustrating the difference in timeline between P's and J's that lend themselves to P's and J's being perceived in certain ways. The second major difference is how the two types like to deal with uncertainty. All right, and what do I mean by dealing with uncertainty? It means that between the time that you are, your quest to find a solution and the point in time in which you finally decide upon a conclusion, during that period of time, how well do you respond to that period of uncertainty, right? Perceivers tend to actually handle this quite well. Simply because, well, of course, if you go back again to the pyramid model, if you're adopting an inductive approach, the sort of unspoken premise goes that the longer you spend engaging in data collection, the more data collection you do, the more comprehensive, possibly the more optimal, and the better your final solution will be. And this is the mindset that perceivers adopt. So they tend to be quite happy with uncertainty. On the other hand, judges tend to really try to stay away from any kind of uncertainty. Of course, like I said before, it really does exist on somewhat of a spectrum. So, there are judges, of course, who cannot tolerate uncertainty at all and make their decision just like that. And of course, on the other side of the spectrum, you do have judges who can tolerate uncertainty a bit more. But in terms of holistically, when you're looking at, the entire data set, perceivers tend to be more comfortable with uncertainty, whereas judges tend to be more uncomfortable with uncertainty. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the third major difference between perceivers and judgers. You must have heard the sort of, I bet if you're Googling, is the difference between P's and J's in terms of structure and organization, the need for structure in their lives. Think about this in terms of the pyramid model. Consider that you're a perceiver. I mean, if you're a perceiver that believes that all your conclusions should be a thorough, holistic, comprehensive sort of package in terms of all the data that you've collected, obviously there's probably less of a need for structure, less of a need for organization than if you're a judger. Now, the second major thing to take away from the pyramid model and in terms of the major differences, you must have, if you've Googled this, as I'm sure most of you have, you probably heard that perceivers tend to be more spontaneous, more adaptable, whereas judgers tend to be more organized, less spontaneous, but certainly more prepared. So judgers don't like going into a situation in which they don't feel that they're prepared for, whereas perceivers tend to be energized by this. Okay, and now, again, going back to the pyramid model, why do you think this is the case? If you're a perceiver, right, and you're not operating, again, you're operating from a very inductive approach. So your ultimate goal is to find a unifying theory that unifies all the evidence that you've collected. What this naturally means is that from t equals 0, when you start to your conclusion, you have no unifying theory because that's your goal, right? So what does this lend itself to? Very often you hear about perceivers being stuck in jobs where they don't see the point, aka, or verbatim, in their words, they don't see the point, right? And this is a very understandable byproduct of the fact that if your ultimate goal is to find a unifying theory, if you work for too hard and it seems like too long analyzing all the evidence and you don't quite get to that unifying theory, you can feel very disillusioned and you can feel very jaded. And this is partially the reason why perceivers in general, of course there are always exceptions, but perceivers in general tend to have less persistence when it comes to long-term planning. In contrast, you have the judgers. Judgers are creatures of organization and structure. Why is this the case? Again, going back to the pyramid model, because you have this very deductive approach, judgers tend to start from a theory, or they tend to identify a theory very early on in their investigative approach, and then they will evaluate all the evidence that they collect after that in terms of whether or not it fits with the theory at hand. Okay, so why does this lend itself to judgers maybe being more organized, maybe seeming to have more longer-term motivation and drive? Well, certainly for the direct inverse of why it may be disillusioning for a perceiver, right? So if you're a judger, you have a unifying theory. To make it maybe a bit cheesier, but certainly hopefully more memorable, is every step that you're doing, every analysis that you're doing at that point, you see there's I don't want to say there's a big picture, but there's a point to what you're doing because you have a unifying theory. You view everything that you're doing in terms of that ultimate goal. So what that lends itself to is certainly a lot more than perceivers, a lot more long-term motivation. And of course, again, I don't want to be regurgitating Google. I want to teach you guys how to interpret the things that you find on Google, right? So this is how to interpret that element of spontaneity versus preparedness, structure and organization versus sort of on the fly, on the go. And again, this sort of short-term or I guess a lesser tendency for perceivers to complete longer-term tasks in terms of when they're contrasted with judgers, certainly. And again, this is all a very sort of giant summary. For the reasons I mentioned, I do simplify quite a lot, but this is something. This pyramid model, I think, is quite useful in terms of understanding the sort of holistic image of perceivers versus judgers. So yeah, that would be perceiving and judging. I know this is a bit long, and I know the lighting isn't ideal. My 3 lamps decided to all die simultaneously on me. So I'm not sure if I'll go into the individual types. If I don't, thank you for persisting with me throughout the series. I will continue to answer your questions. If I get bugged enough, I may go into the individual types. So this is goodbye, but not farewell. So I will see you later, and thank you for watching.